Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
Got one of those stories that was sent to me by a lot of people, including Stephen with a PH. Thank you very much. From Reason.com, Emma Camp wrote this. Georgia police tried to arrest a paralyzed man for kicking down a woman's door and assaulting her and then running away. And so there is what we call a disconnect in this story. Last month, police officers in College Park, Georgia, detained a man for felony assault charges, saying that he had kicked down his ex-girlfriend's door and attempted to strangle her. The only problem is that the man's a paraplegic and has been for more than 20 years, and the quote-unquote ex-girlfriend is somebody he hadn't dated in decades either. So despite the obvious discrepancies, police officers still handcuffed him and tried to take him to jail, even as those officers appeared to be unsure if it was physically possible for him to have done what he was accused of doing. And an officer at one point said, well, if she made a false report, that's going to be on her. It's a warrant now. I have to go ahead and take you in. So now it's going to be up to you and the courts and your lawyers and her to establish your innocence, which of course is not the standard, but so that was from body camera footage. So at this point, she says you kicked down her door. It doesn't look like you could kick anything, no offense, at this point in time. I doubt that he's offended by him pointing that out. In June of last year, a woman called the police and reported that this man, whom she claimed she'd broken up with a few days before, had come to her house, kicked down her door, attacked her, and attempted to steal her car keys. Afterwards, he then left on foot, according to her. In body camera footage obtained by Reason, the woman told police that she didn't want to press charges, which is another problem also. Of course, they can press charges without the victim wanting them pressed, but it's usually at the discretion of the prosecutor. Still, officers obtained an arrest warrant for the man in the wheelchair. It's unclear why it took police so long to detain the man, who said he had been in contact with police for more than a month before coming into the station. So when the man brought himself to the police station, an officer read him his Miranda rights and began questioning him. And the officer asked him if he knew anybody named, and he gave first, middle, and last name of somebody. And the man in the wheelchair says, well, I had an old ex-girlfriend like 20 years ago with that first and middle name, but not that last name. So she'd apparently moved on and gotten married since then. And then the officer said, how long have you been in a wheelchair? And the man said, I've been paralyzed since I'm 18. And by the way, that means that he'd been paralyzed for a decade or two. So the officer says, well, according to the complainant, on this date, you forcefully entered her home and attacked her. And the man in the wheelchair says, I have absolutely no idea who that is. I certainly didn't force my way into anybody's house. Then as the conversation went on, the man in the wheelchair insisted he had no idea why he was being accused of forcibly entering this woman's home or doing anything, because he'd been paralyzed for the past several decades. He was married, and he was not anybody's recent ex-boyfriend. And the officer then said, well, you're being arrested. And the man in the wheelchair said, this is crazy. Is this a joke? So they handcuffed him because that's part of their normal procedure. And after being handcuffed, the man in the wheelchair, who told the officer he had limited muscle control, fell out of his wheelchair and onto the floor. Officers left him there for 3.5 minutes. And when one officer later told another officer about what happened, footage captures the other officer saying, well, it's a ruse, man. It's an obvious attempt not to go to jail. So he's faking it. A third officer expressed misgivings about the arrest. We're going to do our due diligence because if you're paralyzed, somebody must have made a mistake, the officer said. Now, of course, saying someone made a mistake might be an understatement. Later, that officer told the other officer that the man's legs looked similar to the limbs of some of his own family members who were paralyzed, indicating that he didn't think the man in the wheelchair was lying about having been paralyzed for decades. And he said, I would suggest calling the district attorney's office, let them know what you got. But then the other officer interjected and said, because now it's looking like she might have made a false report. Oh? So police, as Reason points out, may have had more reason to doubt the story that the woman told, and they could have conducted a brief internet search where they would discover that last year the same woman was criminally charged after making false allegations that an Airbnb guest had stolen property. So she was charged with making a false allegation to the police. Now, it's a different sort of allegation, but a person who will lie to the police is someone you got to take a look at, right? So the detectives and so on insisted that the man in the wheelchair would still have to go to jail. And it would be up to him to come up with the documentation proving his innocence at a later court hearing. And of course, that's backwards. But in addition to insisting he was innocent, the man in the wheelchair argued to the officers that his complicated medical needs made taking him to the Fulton County Jail dangerous for his health. After a lengthy back and forth, he convinced officers to let him go on the promise that he'd eventually turn himself in. But even though he could leave, he still had the felony arrest warrant out against him. In an email sent this week to the College Park Police Department obtained by Reason, the woman who is the quote-unquote victim here recanted her allegations. I can put the word victim in those kind of quotes because she recanted. She says, "It has been brought to my attention that my mental state and physical trauma in that moment worked to confuse me into providing information that needs to be edited. Will you please contact me at your earliest convenience so I can edit the information in the report and clear the name of an innocent man?" Now, police did not revoke the warrant right away. And it's unclear if they did that because they didn't believe her. But ironically, if they don't believe her when it comes to correcting her report, why do they believe her on the initial report? I know it's possible you could say, but Steve, what if the guy was faking this whole thing? She was scared of him and now she wants to recant because she doesn't want him to come after her. That's possible, but that seems like a real crazy stretch. And by the way, you understand that when you put her on the stand and say, isn't it true that you did call us and say he attacked you? Defense attorney then gets up and say, isn't it true you also went to withdraw your statement? I mean, so the man in the wheelchair now has an attorney. He told Reason that while it was reasonable for police to critically examine whether the man in the wheelchair could have committed the crime, say if he had become paralyzed in the months between the alleged incident and when he got arrested, it was their lack of curiosity about his claims of obvious innocence that troubled him. It's not so much that they should have just said, oh, he didn't do it, but they should have been like, let's not get the warrant yet. Let's do some more investigation because I'm not sure. That's really what's missing. And when courts look at probable cause, part of a police officer's duty is not just to find probable cause, but also to dispel suspicion of a crime. That's part of what they're supposed to do, and to do it in a reasonably prompt manner. So as you can imagine, if somebody wants to get the affidavit, to get the warrant, they can put in all the stuff that goes their way. And they can say, this woman was acquainted with this man. She knows him by sight. They spent time together. They were dating. Then, at a later date, they broke up. Then, at a later date, he, according to her, came to the house, kicked down the door, attacked her, and tried to grab her keys, and then ran away. And then if you submit that, someone's going to look at that and go, oh my gosh, yeah, of course. But you see, the officers should also then say, you know, how far apart were these things that happened? And now, don't get me wrong, an officer might not have known the man was in a wheelchair. But the second they show up and see something that glaring, they should go, okay, wait a second. Is this guy really in a wheelchair? And is he paraplegic? Because if they went to his house, for instance, or the place he lived, they can probably look around and see if, in fact, his house is set up for somebody who is a paraplegic, right? And, you know, obviously, if the guy's got a wheelchair, I suppose he could have the wheelchair handy and jump into it really quick and go, look, I'm paralyzed. But you look around his house and see what the house looks like. But also, it shouldn't be that hard to ask him, can you show us some evidence, the documentation or something? What happened to you? Like, were you in a car accident? What? You know, and I suspect the guy could come up with something to confirm that he is, in fact, paralyzed. So, as the attorney points out, it's their lack of curiosity. And, you know, it's funny because I've never heard that word, curiosity, used in connection with a police officer investigating a crime. But many people are fascinated and hobbyists of studying true crime. And one of the reasons is that crimes and mysteries do pique your curiosity. How did this happen? Who did this? Why? And so you'd think that someone who goes into law enforcement as a career might have a natural curiosity that would have them asking questions such as, what happened? Who did this? Why? And that curiosity would certainly be, I would think, tweaked by a guy going, I'm in a wheelchair. And I have not known anybody by that name, but I recognize the first two names as a woman I dated decades ago. So somebody might go, wait a second. And by the way, all a police officer have to do is pick up the phone and call the complainant and go, hey, we got a question over here. The guy's in a wheelchair. It says he's been in a wheelchair for decades. And he says that he dated you 20 years ago. Which of those, are those statements true? Do you know? Or like when you were dating him, was he in a wheelchair? And I suspect that she would have then said, oh, I need to edit my complaint. So that's one of the things that always strikes me is when I see somebody in the process of doing something. And once the process starts, they're going to take it to the end. So we got a warrant. Let's arrest this guy. We're going to handcuff him, read him his rights, take him to the police station. Blah, blah, blah. That's the process, right? There's not a rule that says once the process has started, you can't stop and make a 3-minute phone call. Now, I know it's possible. She might not answer the phone or she might lie. I don't know. But the point is that it would have looked so much better if an officer had said, wait a second. He says he's paralyzed. She says he's not. Why not just make that quick phone call to her? And if nothing else, it's going to shore up your case for when you prosecute her for filing a false police report. Because you've already prosecuted her once for that. Somebody has. So the attorney for the man in the wheelchair has now told Reason that police informed him that the warrant was recently dismissed. So the warrant has been dismissed. The woman's recanted her allegations. The allegations actually made no sense to begin with. And somehow, again, the police did, in fact, arrest the man, handcuff him, and say, we're arresting you because someone says you kicked, not forced your way through the door, you kicked in the door. And by definition, see, that's the kind of thing. Occasionally I have people say, Steve, you're too nitpicky with the language. No. The term that he kicked in the door implies he did it with his foot, okay? Or both his feet, right? If he'd forced the door, could have been with anything. But they say he kicked in the door or kicked down the door. And he kicked down the door and supposedly attacked her, tried to grab the keys. Could he have gone into her place and attacked her in the wheelchair? Hypothetically. And that's a problem also. So crazy story. Thanks to everybody who sent it, including Stephen with a PH. Emma Camp wrote its great article from Reason.com. Georgia police tried to arrest a paralyzed man for kicking down a woman's door and assaulting her, but she's now recanted that story. Questions or comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. You're not obligated to win. You're obligated to keep trying to do the best you can every day.